Vi tar det här väldigt kort. Välkomna allihopa. Jag är så oerhört glad att ni är här. Jag är så oerhört glad att Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie är här för att samtala ikväll med Jannike Åhlund. Mitt namn är Jenny Högström och jag är koordinator för Internationell Författarscen som Göteborg, som består av Författarcentrum Väst, Stadsbiblioteket, Kultur i Väst, Bok och bibliotek, Göteborg och Company. Och vi har arrangerat det här seminariet ihop med Göteborg International Film Festival och ABF Göteborg. Och innan vi börjar så är det väldigt viktigt att vi respekterar att vi har 3 nödutgångar. Där och här. Och att de är fria. Ni som inte får plats får gärna stå kvar och lyssna. And briefly in English, so we have 3 emergency exits. Over there, and here. And when you go out, you go straight out and to the right. And now I leave the mic to Jannike and to Chimamanda. Please welcome.
Just say on though. Hello. Hello. Close encounter, I guess. So, Chimamanda, you have a large following and a huge readership here in Sweden, not only because of this particular novel that we will focus on in our conversation, but you had several novels published in Sweden. And you were here just, a few months ago when you participated in the literary festival in Stockholm. So there seems to be this thing between you and Sweden. You keep coming back.
I'm having an affair with Sweden. Hello.
Hörs det dåligt eller? Ja. Ja, jag kan inte göra så mycket mer åt det. Men kan vi få hjälp? Jag kanske bara ska hålla närmare. Hörs jag bättre nu? Ja, okej.
Oh, right. So yes, I said is mine working? Yeah. You can hear me. Well, I just want to say thank you for coming. It's just really nice to see that people actually came. So thank you. Thank you. I appreciate your coming. I like Sweden. And really, the real reason I like Sweden is that Sweden is the one country where my publishers give me the best covers. This is why. So when I love that cover. I think it's a relevant cover. If you're writing about Africa and you're published in different countries, you have to be prepared for all kinds of covers. So for a novel that's really set in Nigeria and mostly urban, there have been countries where the covers have had jungles, giraffes, lions. This is true. This is true. So all the Swedish covers have been very respectful, very relevant.
This is a high society woman.
Please keep the microphone to your mouth. They don't hear.
Oh, I guess you have to be extremely close to it. Yeah. Sorry about this. You have to eat the mics.
Right.
So, given that we're at the film festival and this afternoon was the first screening of Half of a Yellow Sun, based of course on your novel, I'd like to start by asking you, what sort of a writer are you? Are you the kind that will, say, go ahead and film it, or would you have some hesitation as to losing control of your own material?
I think if a book is being made into a film, you do lose control. But I suppose I'm the kind of writer who hesitates, but not because I'm worried about losing control, because I don't want to be involved in the first place. But it's just a hesitation based on a book meaning so much to you, and then being worried that the film might not do justice to the novel. So that would be the basis of my hesitation.
And would you say it did justice to your novel?
Yes.
But how could you say otherwise with the director in the audience? Biyi Bandele.
I think Biyi knows that if I didn't think so, I would say so.
And also it must have been reassuring the fact that Biyi is not only a brilliant debutant filmmaker, but a novelist and a playwright himself, so he knows on what terrain he was, right?
Yeah, but I think it's also just feeling that we both share a certain kind of heartbroken love for Nigeria. And after I talked to him, I realized that we see Nigeria through the same eyes, and I knew that he just wouldn't make a bad film. I just knew.
And could you tell us just a bit about how it happened? I know this is would be a question for you too. Well, maybe you should tell us how it happened. I mean, what was the first? No, well, however you want to do it. You can say first. Chimamanda.
Well, when you say how it happened, you mean how did the film come about?
Yeah.
Well, I can't talk about the process because I wasn't involved at all. I wouldn't even see the script. He wanted me to read it, but I didn't want to. It really started with talking about it. We were in Nigeria. Biyi wanted to go see Nsukka, which is where most of the book is set, and which is where I grew up. And so we drove from Lagos to Nsukka. My brother was driving. Biyi was in front, I was behind. And the drive took, I don't know, 7 hours or 8 hours. And in that time, we talked. And while he talked, I was watching him and listening and trying to figure out if he was a good guy or a bad guy. And at the end of the journey, I thought, not bad.
And so then you didn't really meddle then?
No, so I said, so in many ways it was me saying, I'm putting the cutting of my baby in your hands. And I don't want to be there when my baby's cut up.
It might be your telephone, we'll just ignore it. But I've heard rumored that among this audience, there are actually 5 people in the audience who have not read the story. So for their benefit, I will just make a quick summary, and maybe they've seen the film, but anyway. So the story depicts the lives of a 13-year-old houseboy who serves and is educated by a revolutionary university professor. And it's also about the professor's girlfriend, a sociology instructor from an elite family in Nigeria, and an aspiring Biafran, an Igbo-speaking Englishman, during the Biafran War, in which the Igbo people in southeastern Nigeria attempted to create an independent republic. So my question would be, given the broad scope of this story, it's a sort of Nigerian Gone with the Wind. Were you ever hesitant that, you know, how is this poor guy going to cram this vast story into a regular feature film?
I think it's better than Gone with the Wind.
Well, I was thinking in terms more of, you know, the story of a decline of a family and decline of a lifestyle going down the drains. So, with no other comparisons.
Well, not really, no. I think I realized that, I think it maybe started with my knowing that I wasn't going to be involved, so I didn't really, I think I also know that if you're going to make a film from a book, and especially a book like that, you can't have everything in it. You just can't. And so really it's a question of what choices you make. And actually though, we had one conversation, and when Biyi told me what the focus of the film would be, I nearly had a heart attack. So I decided we would not have any other conversations about it. And it was sort of like, this is the cinematic potential, and film is different, and I just sat there thinking, he does not know how many months of horrible hard work went into creating what he wanted to take out. So then I realized it. And I have friends who have had their books made into films, and the advice was just stay away from it because it's a different form, and there's just no way the film is going to be the book. And
one of those, I was speaking about the focus of the film, in the film the focus is definitely more on the twin sisters rather than Ugu, who plays a larger role in the novel. And before we see a clip introducing the two sisters, what were your thoughts with this twin theme?
I don't understand. Do you mean
well, what I mean is, did you think, as was it a sort of a literary device in being able to tell, the different stories of the sisters, or was that?
No. I think if anything, it was that I didn't want them to have age be a factor between them. I think the only reason I made them twins is I wanted the dynamics of the relationship to be about their personalities. And if they had been born in a Nigerian family and one was older than the other, the age would affect the dynamics. And so I didn't want that. So that's really why I made them twins.
I see. So I thought maybe we can see the first clip, just to present us for those of you who haven't seen
Lovely
it.
to meet you. Oh, lovely to meet you.
And given that they are twins, the choice of Tandy Newton, that is of course not your choice, but she is very white, being the twin sister of Olana. But was that ever a consideration?
I don't think she's very white. I think this is actually, maybe this is a good opportunity to talk about the different ranges of color in which black people come. Because there are two things. I think if people said she's not Nigerian, and we object to that, I would be very sympathetic to it, but if people said she's somehow not black or she's too white, she's darker than my brother. I have a brother, really, my little brother Kene, and we have the same parents. He's lighter than Tandy. It's that thing where black people actually come in a diverse range of colors. And in one family, somebody can be like Tandy and somebody else can be like me. And it worries me that there's an idea that there's only one, to be authentically African, the darker the better. Dark is good, there's also the light, right? So I didn't have a problem with that at all. And she looks like what is called yellow Igbo in Nigeria. Igbo people generally, and this is also, during the period, there were people, if you were light-skinned in Lagos, you were likely to be attacked because people assumed you were Igbo. Because Igbo people are said to have a greater likelihood of being light-skinned. And so there's an expression in Nigeria which is called Igbo yellow, right? Which doesn't necessarily have a positive connotation. But so she looks like an Igbo yellow girl. I don't think any Nigerian who watches this without an agenda would say that she looks foreign, because she doesn't.
But in the transition from book to film, the most striking difference is maybe time structure, where in the book you allow yourself to crisscross back and forth in time, whereas the film basically follows a chronological structure. Did you, when you saw the film, did you consider this a loss or more like a necessary movie storytelling device?
Yeah, I didn't expect the film to necessarily mirror the book. And I'm not sure it would have worked in film. I don't know very much about film, but I don't know if the structure of the book would have worked in the film. So it wasn't a loss to me. I think of the film as, I enjoyed it. When I first watched it the first time, 20 minutes in, I was riveted, and I remember thinking, what's going to happen next, right? And then I remember that I wrote the book. This is true. So I didn't come to it expecting to have page by page, sort of scene by scene. No.
That must have been very reassuring for the director to hear. the fact that the writer is waiting for the next event in the film. Speaking about storytelling, you've spoken earlier about how single stories create stereotypes. And in the 60s, when I grew up, there were two stories really relating to the Biafran War. And one, of course, was the heroism of the Swedish pilot, Carl Gustaf von Rosen, who made a great effort supporting the rebels. And you also mentioned him in your novel, actually. And then there was this picture that everyone growing up in those days remember, was those collection boxes, insamlingsbössor, för barnen i Biafra, with those famined, the black child suffering from famine. And I'm curious as to if your novel has made the many stories of that period in Nigeria resurf in a public discussion.
I think it has. But I do want to say that the pictures of the children, they were starving because there was a policy on the side of the Nigerian government to keep food away. So it wasn't sort of an act of nature or a famine of any sort. Sorry, I just went blank. This is what happens when you haven't slept well. What was the other question?
No, if it's the film, or I mean the novel and the film, but the film hasn't premiered yet.
Oh,
so
right.
if the novel has contributed to
Yes,
raising these issues and the story of, or the history rather, of the war and how it's looked upon.
I think it has. I like to think it has. That since the novel came out, there is. When I was working on the book, when I told people I was researching Biafra, they would say back off, and I mean from both sides. People who had experienced Biafra and people who had been on the Nigerian side. They would say leave it alone, the past is the past, that kind of thing. But again, it's a part of our history that we don't really know about. Many Nigerians of my generation don't really know what happened. And many of us, particularly the Nigerians who were not Biafrans, whose families were not Biafrans, don't really know what happened. And for me, it was a very personal thing to write the book, but also I think a part of me, I wanted to tell the story for my generation of Nigerians. I was hoping that we would start to talk about our history. Because I think a lot of what's happening today we can trace back to 1967. And I think that's happened. I think people are talking about it more. And for me, one of the best compliments is to be told that after reading Half of a Yellow Sun, they wanted to go read more about that period.
So one part of it is ignorance, but would you say it's also a contested part of your history still?
It is, and it's not so much ignorance as it is, it's also in the way that countries like to hide the parts of their history that they're not particularly proud of or that they haven't quite settled. Nigeria does that with that period. So we don't really teach young people about the war. And so yes, it's contested still very much, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I think that it's possible to have two different versions of history, but it's important to have those versions. Right? The thing was, it seemed to me there was just a silence. And now what's happening is that people are telling their stories. And so it's...
And you're focusing quite a bit, of course, on the role of the Igbo. And how would you describe their role today? Are they Igbo part of Nigerian society today, or integrated, or how would you describe the Igbo situation for the Igbos?
Now to give you a treatise on the Igbo situation.
Okay.
I don't know what the Igbo situation is. Okay. Well, I'm Igbo and I'm Nigerian, so I suppose we are integrated. Look, I think Nigeria has our problem. In Nigeria, there are various dissatisfactions and agitations, and I think right now that maybe the biggest problem in that sense would be the Niger Delta, not Igbo land. I think that I think Igbo people feel as Nigerian as anyone else, but that's not to say that ethnicity is no longer politicized in the way that it was in the 60s, because it still very much is.
And this is, I think, a good occasion maybe to see the second clip, which takes place in an airport where the first, what should I call it? When they go after the Igbos in the story, when, pardon me? Yeah, exactly. Let's call it what it is. It's a massacre. And I think it's also an extremely well handled scene in the film. So maybe we can see that.
Iranzi abolished the regions by decree. This was the last
And I understand that part of your research when writing about the atrocities that happened during the war was by interviewing members of your own family.
No, I tried to read everything I could find about that period. So I tried to read every book that had been published about Biafra. I looked at archives, I looked at newspapers, I listened to audio clips, that sort of thing. But it was important for me to hear what it had felt like. And I felt that all the reading I did was to give me the framework and to give me the facts. But from people I interviewed, I wanted to get the truths. And so I talked to my parents' friends, my extended family, really anybody I thought might have a Biafran story. I would harass them until.
And is it correct that both of your grandparents died in the camp?
Both my grandfathers died. My grandmother survived the war, but both my grandfathers died in refugee camps. And they were both very, very proud, titled Igbo men who were both reluctant to leave their hometowns when the hometowns were about to fall. And they both ended up in refugee camps and they died in 1969 and 1968.
And you've spent some time in America. Did you write this particular novel there? Did you need the distance or?
No, I wrote it in a number of places because it took quite a while. I wrote parts of, there was a time when I needed to go back, not just to Nigeria, but to my hometown. So I went to Aba. And my uncle, who's now died, but he fought in the war. And when I was writing the book, I had talked to him earlier, of course, but when I was writing the scenes where Ugwu it's conscripted. I wanted to be there. I wanted to be in Aba. I wanted my uncle close by, and so I went, and I wrote parts of it in the US, I wrote parts of it in Lagos, I wrote parts of it in England. I was obsessed for 6 years, so that's all I did.
And where do you call home today?
Nigeria.
And, well, before we leave the subject of films altogether, this last year has seen a surge of films about either African-themed stories or African-American stories, like Long Walk to Freedom, which premiered here just yesterday. The Butler, Fruitvale Station, 12 Years a Slave, of course, where Chiwetel Ejiofor, who plays one of the leads in your film, has been Oscar nominated. Just to mention a few. So, why now, do you think?
I don't know. I mean, why do you have films with black people in them? I don't know.
No, that wasn't really what I asked.
Because I don't mean to be facetious, but I think that there is.
I was really, if I'm to clarify my question, it's
I
like
don't necessarily think it's a bad question, by the way.
Okay.
Right? Because we should talk about why there aren't many films with black people in them and why it becomes remarkable. Because it is remarkable, right?
Well,
It's supposed to be the age of Obama, I suppose. I don't know.
I don't either. So that was just a question because there's been many who have gained international attention, which we all agree is a good thing. It's just there have been so few of them, and then in 1 year, whoops, it all happens.
Maybe they,
Finally.
yeah, maybe film producers suddenly realize the glaring truth that there's massive talent in the black community.
That would be nice. Yeah. And by the way, Chiwetel Ejiofor, who acts in your film in Half of Yellow Sun, his actor colleague in 12 Years, Lupita Nyong'o, has raised quite a stir, it seems, by wearing her hair natural Afro style. I'm pointing to myself, there's nothing Afro about that, but this is also an issue, as it happens, in your latest novel, Americanah, where you make the case that African women should go natural. Can you speak more about that, a little more about that?
I don't think I make the case that African women should go natural. I think it's about, I have a character who decides that she doesn't want to put chemicals in her hair. And it came from, and it's something I care about in a very deep and passionate way, because I don't believe that hair is just hair, particularly when it concerns black women. I think that black women are the only women in the world who spend so much time, effort, money to make their hair look as different as possible from the way it looks when it grows from their scalps. And I think that there's a significance to that. It's because we live in a world that has defined mainstream beauty as something that's not us. And so we strive to approximate that. So when I was growing up, I felt that I was made to think, and I think this is true for many young black women, that my hair was ugly. It wasn't about being difficult to comb. It was that it was unsightly. And so you needed to do something about it. And so I looked forward very much to the holidays when my mother would stretch my hair with a hot comb. Now, this often resulted in burnt ears and burning Vaseline dripping on your neck, but I didn't mind because it meant I would then have straight hair that I could swing. But I've just come to the point where I feel like, and I really believe this, my hair doesn't have to swing. People who have hair that can swing, that's nice, but there are also people God made with hair that's not supposed to swing, and we shouldn't spend our time trying to make it swing. And I, it's something that I just, yeah, so, but of course I'm not saying that everybody should wear dramatic hairstyles, such as this one. I'd like to talk about this hairstyle.
Please do.
So for my Swedish friends who might like to try this, it's called Isio, and
I can tell from close up that it is extremely complicated.
it's not as scary as it looks, believe me. It's an old and traditional Nigerian style. My mother, I was looking at old pictures some years ago, and I saw pictures of my mother from the 1960s and 1970s. And she and her friends, there were cocktail parties in the university, and they all had their hair done in thread. And I thought it looked very beautiful. And I remember thinking, why have we lost that? Because nobody does that anymore. And so I thought I would try and do it. So that's the story of the issue.
And yet you haven't told us how in detail do you make that
Oh, right.
hair?
So if you want to try it, I'm sure that there must be African places, but it's very hard to find somebody who can actually thread. So you'll have to call a few places, and then you have to buy the thread. So what it means is your hair gets divided in sections, and then it's wrapped in thread. So it's actually, this is thread. And then when you're taking it out, it's fun, because you pull the thread and your hair goes zzz. I would recommend it to all my Swedish friends.
And we want to see that unwrapping procedure on a YouTube clip soon.
I'll keep that in mind.
Something entirely different. In Beyoncé's latest surprise video, you're making an important contribution. Can you tell us how that came about?
No.
Okay, so that's that. Let's move on to something else. No. No, but you are. In one of the videos, because I understand there are several, like one for each song, but then there is a whole section of a TED talk that you had once, which said we should all be feminists. So it's an excerpt of that, and well.
Yeah, I think we should all be feminists.
Yeah.
There's somebody who looks like a Nigerian brother of mine who's shaking his head. It's like, I'm not having this. We need to talk. Because the idea is I want to start a conversation about this. It's about the word, about taking back that word, because it's been so loaded with a lot of negative baggage that people like him would immediately shake their heads and say no. And I think I want to start a conversation with my generation of men and women, not just women, because I think gender is a problem that men have to be engaged with as well. And because men largely are in positions of privilege, they have the choice of not engaging with gender, but they have to. Women don't really have the choice because gender affects the way they live their lives. Yeah, so I do hear that there are a few young women who now choose to be called feminists, and I find that very encouraging because unless we have, I suppose you can talk about the problem without the word, but unless you have a word to rally around, then you can't really start to engage with the problems and talk about how we can fix them.
How will we fix them?
We can fix them by raising, we can't fix them now, it's too late, but we can fix them in 50 years, 100 years. If the women who are having children today raise their children differently. That's really I don't think, people talk about educating people in schools, it has to start from homes. And if we're raising, we still have families in Nigeria where girls are still told to go make food for their brothers, and sometimes the brothers are younger, so it's really just you're a girl, you have a particular kind of reproductive organ, therefore you have to cook. And you're a boy, you don't have to cook. And even that, which is a very tiny example, but what it's doing, I think, is you're raising that boy to grow up to be a man who expects certain things. And I think that's dangerous in so many ways. And yeah, so I think it would be about raising children differently.
It leaves the boy in a very comfortable position.
Yeah, mostly, but even that, I think gender is also a bad thing for guys and men and boys. They might occupy a position of relative privilege, but in some ways it's also a prison. Because there are also gender expectations for men, which I think can hold men back. When we live in a world where we say that we define macho-ness in a particular way, I think there are many men who would love to not be macho.
To break out of their macho prison.
Yes.
So do you see this in terms of feminism or gender question? Do you see this in different light? Depending on which country you're in, like Nigeria or US or same, only with variations.
I think it's the same thing. I do think that sometimes, it manifests itself differently, but I'm sometimes struck by how and I don't mean this I suppose it wouldn't sound very kind, but how remarkably backward some European countries are on the subject of gender. And it's a backwardness that's not acknowledged. So the story that the culture tells itself is that, oh, we're sort of, forward-looking and forward-thinking because now women can vote, But really, there are many cultural assumptions that are startling in the level of their misogyny, and even more startling how they're not even acknowledged and addressed and called out. And I say this about European countries, and maybe I should say the West in general, because there's also, I think, the assumption that somehow, I go to do events and people tell me, what's the state of women in Nigeria? Right? So somehow we're all supposed to feel sorry for women in Nigeria, and we're supposed to tell them tales of just terrible deprivation. And there are those tales, but there are also times when I'm in Nigeria and I think there's progress being made on gender. There are times when I see women of a certain age who don't think that their lives are somehow incomplete without men, in a way that women in the West still hold on to ideas of that sort. So, yeah, it's all the same, it's just a different kind of manifestation for each of us.
I've just seen the short film competition here, and I can tell you there's several really good entries there dealing with this particular question. So let's hope, we'll see each other again 50 years from now and see how far we've gotten here. And I read somewhere that to backtrack a bit to your childhood, that your first literary role model, or rather inspiration, was Enid Blyton, of all writers. And for those of you who have read Enid Blyton, you know these are adventures with proper white little kids in very controlled, experiencing adventures in a very controlled setting. So how on earth could you feel kinship with these little brats?
They were not brats, I love them.
Sorry.
I think that's what literature can do. I think a good story. And I really did love those books. And now as an adult, I realized the politics of it. I mean, Blyton was sort of, right-wing, and she probably wouldn't want people like me to come to England, that sort of thing. But I still love those books. And there's a magic to good storytelling, I think. And so here I was in Osaka, reading these books about the famous five, for example, going to explore a dungeon in an old abandoned castle, and just being completely swept away by it. And I think it's also how I grew up reading books that had nothing to do with my reality, and I loved them. I think that's what storytelling does. I think there's the magic of literature, is that you can, you can inhabit another world.
So nowadays, who would you say are the authors that you feel affinity with?
There are too many. There's so many writers I love. I can tell you who I'm reading now. I'm reading rereading Michael Ondaatje's memoir. I'm Running in the Family. I am also reading Derek Walcott's poetry, which I read over and over. There's so many writers I love, and they just come from wherever. I'm drawn to different things in different writers.
And what about the Nigerian writers that we know about, Chinua Achebe and Benokri?
Chinua Achebe, I often said, is the writer whose work is most important to me, and that's because I like to think of his work as what gave me permission to tell my own stories. So before I read and loved him, because I think there's a difference between reading things and just thinking they're okay, and reading them and just loving them. So his novel, Arrow of God, I absolutely loved. And he made me then want to write stories about people who were like me, because he was writing. But also his stories were kind of exotic, because they're set in sort of 1910, 1920s Igbo land. And while I identified with many things, I thought they were still exotic because it was removed from my existence. But what it did was it gave me a kind of permission, confidence.
So it was a sort of impetus for writing yourself, really?
Not for writing, but for writing what felt true.
In today's literature, there's a lot of talk about style, the way you shape your prose. So how do you handle the act of balance between form, style, whatever, and substance? That's maybe a very Well, anyway. In what terms do you think of this?
I don't.
No, you just write.
And I don't think that many creative people do. I think it's the sort of thing one has to think about talking about when you're promoting a novel. I don't think when you're sitting down thinking, well, I don't know about other people, but I think you're thinking about inhabiting a world, bringing a character to life, feeling something. For me, writing is largely emotional. When it's going well, I'm just really happy and I feel transported. And when it's not going well, I'm really unhappy. So, and it's not all conscious. So I don't really spend a lot of time thinking about, is the style here and the substance here. It's a larger, more diffuse thing.
Now I'm crisscrossing a bit here myself, but going back to the past again, I also read somewhere that you had planned to become a psychiatrist, and then you would have used your patient stories for fiction. Brilliant idea. But what made you change your mind?
I was thinking about those poor patients. I thought this is not good. I left after a year because I wasn't happy. It wasn't the right thing for me. And in Nigeria, and I think in many other countries in Africa, you do well in school, they tell you have to be a doctor. So I just accepted that, since I did well in school, I had to become a doctor. And it wasn't, and I was, I did well. I sort of, the exams in chemistry and physics and biology, I did very well, but I didn't care. And I think that was very important. I realized sitting there in class, I just didn't fundamentally care. And I was interested in writing very bad poems at the back of my notebooks instead of actually paying attention. And so I thought, I can't do this, so I decided to leave. And it's not normal, by the way, and I had parents who were, for Nigeria, you get into medical school, you stay there. You don't just get up and leave and say you're unhappy. I had parents who were very kind, but who already had a doctor, my sister. So they were willing to let me go.
But writing was something you did really all along, as far as you can remember.
Yeah, I don't remember when I didn't write. When I was 4, I've been writing for as long as I could spell.
Identity is a recurring theme in your books, and the Igbo identity in Half of Yellow Sun and Black identity in Americanah, your latest novel, plus the African identity you've spoken of recently. So in what order do you identify or describe yourself in terms of identity?
I'm sorry, I don't think I understand that. Do you mean what's most important?
Writer, woman,
oh.
Yeah, and also identity. You've been dealing with these questions a lot when you left Nigeria and came to the States, and being a black person in the States, where, if I recall it correctly, you say that was the first time you really had to ponder over that sort of identity.
Right. Oh, so I don't think of them, I think that I'm many things at the same time, and it's not so much that there's a hierarchy of identities for me as it is that in different places one becomes different things. So when I'm in Nigeria, when I'm in the US or outside Nigeria, but not in Africa, I'm African. Actually, when I'm in other African countries, I feel I forget where I was going, but I stopped at the airport in Ethiopia, and I just felt this wonderful Pan-African joy, because there were all of these flights going to all of these places in Africa, and some of these little places I hadn't even heard of. And not only was I thrilled that flights went there, I was thrilled that I just discovered this, and I remember sitting there thinking, this is what Pan-Africanism means. I was so happy to be in that airport in Ethiopia. There was absurdly happy, but yes.
So that was a new identity being discovered.
Yes. I wouldn't have that joy in Nigeria because there would be no reason to have that joy. No, I'm kidding. So many things. I think of myself as African, as black, as Igbo. I was just in my hometown for Christmas and I felt very Igbo because I was in a world where people spoke mostly Igbo, where I then had to speak mostly Igbo, and then and in some ways I think you become a different version of yourself. I think that when I'm in my hometown, I'm a slightly different version of myself. When I'm in Lagos, I become a slightly different version. And I think this is true for most people. So I'm hoping that I'm not strange in this regard. I think of myself as gender is an important thing, so I look at the world through, but many other things as well. Writer, dreamer.
Those are good identities, all of them. And when you were in Sweden last time at the Stockholm Literature Festival, you spoke about this is a huge subject, I know, but I'm entering it anyway, the relation between Europe and Africa. Would it be fair to say in a generalizing fashion that colonialism is really the root of all or most evil in today's Africa?
Yes?
Yes.
No,
Okay.
This is something where you're supposed to say, no, I need to be more nuanced. It's not the root of, like, the reason I worry about this is because usually the conversations of this sort end up being, is it either this or that, right?
But I could rephrase it. Is it more of a modern sort of colonialism at work today, or is it just the same, only where you're very wanted tonight? No, that's not you. Anyway, so no, but so that was my rephrasing of the question. Is it just the same old colonialism within a new 2000-year shape, or is it really the same mechanisms at work when we speak about colonialism in its modern shape?
I'm not sure I understand that. Do you mean today?
Well,
what's the old form?
Yeah, the old form is the old-fashioned form is where the European countries own a lot of territory in Africa and have slaves, and that's the old kind. But today, I imagine we're dealing with a more subtle form where it's not so obvious. And
I was just reading a piece about how the French, how the value of the Francophone African countries' currency is determined by the central bank in France. So that in itself, I think, is interesting. But I think, for me, thinking about colonialism, what I find quite interesting is that we talk about histories of nations, and we take a very long-term view in general, but we don't when it comes to the nations in Africa. So we can talk about how let me think about what I know about Swedish history. Right, you know how Sweden went around sort of colonizing the other Scandinavian areas, right? Which leads to a lot of resentment today, but nobody talks about it.
But that's a long stretch also, that's
Right.
17th century.
Yeah, but the resentment simmers today. There is still that resentment, yeah? Talk to the Norwegians. And this is true.
What?
Right.
They don't love us?
I know you would think they do, but actually no. So, no, but this is true, but maybe not that sort of thing. But so let's talk about how England, for example, so that the process of state formation, or we can talk about, when we talk about countries in Europe, we talk about how much the Renaissance period has contributed to present-day European cultural institutions. Now, how many years ago was that? Now, in Africa, the nations, which are really still really fledgling creations, they're only 50 years old, but somehow the expectation is that they should have pulled out a perfect democracy from thin air. And I say thin air because colonialism was a dictatorship. It wasn't anything remotely like a democracy. And so when from a dictatorship, you then carve out countries and sort of say, all right, rule yourselves, you now have a parliamentary system of democracy. There's no way you're going to get it right. It's going to take a while. And so for me, talking about colonialism, it's simply to say we cannot somehow pretend that what's happening in present-day DRC has nothing to do with Belgium, because it doesn't make sense. Of course it has a lot to do with it. But I'm not interested in questions of who is to blame. Is it Africans or is it Europe? Because I just think it makes it too simplistic. But the reason that this conversation, I think, is important is that it's come to the point where we no longer talk about the responsibility of Europe. We talk about the charity of Europe. So we talk about, oh, help the poor Africans. But nobody's asking, why are they poor? Why do they need to be helped? Right? What's the story? Because every nation has a history, and history really is a series of connecting stories. And so, yeah, so that's why I think it's important. That's how I look at the colonial story, rather than sort of, is Europe responsible for? Although I could give you a simplistic answer, which is yes.
No, this is a perfect treatise. thinking that there might be quite a few persons in the audience here who would like to take this opportunity to raise a question with Chimamanda. And this is your Nigerian brother who gets the first question. Are you a feminist now?
Okay, no, we can't ask the question, sorry.
Okay, next question. You may, though.
Okay. Before I ask my question, I'd like to first clarify why I shook my head when you mentioned feminism. So an average average Nigerian man, 9 times out of 10, if you ask us what's the opposite of a feminist, we will not say a machoist or something. We'll say a chauvinist, which is what? It's like building 2 armies against each other and telling one that, oh, those are feminists, they're really dangerous. You have to stay away from them. You know, it's there's a resentment against the war of feminism. It's not the fact that we're talking about women's rights. That's not why there's a resentment. It's the war of feminism. It's like saying all men should die. That's how it feels to a Nigerian man. Like, we don't need men in the world. So
yeah, do we? I'm kidding. Here's a no, but you know.
Should all men die, Chimamanda?
That's how feminism is like a weapon to...
But that's what I mean about taking the word back, because it's really not,
exactly.
Right?
Yeah. So the idea is not wrong, it's that word, it's scary, so
But we should also ask why it's scary to men.
Yeah,
because, you know...
that on our mothers then.
Because people will often say, why do you talk about feminism, why don't you talk about human rights? And yes, but the point is, we're talking about feminism because there is a group of people in the world who for centuries have been systematically deprived of rights because they were women. So that's why we talk about feminism. That's why it has to be about women, right? Because those are the people whose rights were taken away. Yes. And we can't somehow pretend that, oh, let's just talk about the human race and make it all wishy-washy. No, it's women who had the... So it has to be feminist, and you have to become one.
So now my question. Now I have my question, which is that before I ask, I would like to let you know that my reasons are not to criticize the film in any way. It's the fact that I've met Biyi. Biyi was here in 2010 during a book fair at Spencer Mason, and he gave me an autographed copy of his book Cover Boy at the time. So in my eyes, you two can do no wrong. So in this situation where there's a project that involves both Chimamanda Adichie and Biyi Bandele, to me it's perfect. But I'm also a member of a group called the Nollywood Screenwriters and Critics Association. And this film for us, when you talk about our generation...
So the gentleman here has said, he's coming to the question, and if I summarize, he says that the project involving Chimamanda and Biyi Bandele, who has directed the film, is perfect.
Yeah.
And he's referring to the Nollywood film industry. Yeah. Is this a Nollywood film? Is that maybe the question?
No, it's not. It's an indie film that has nothing to do with Nollywood.
Okay.
I'm just saying that the story of this film is not an Igbo story, in my opinion, and in the opinion of a lot of people I've talked to.
He doesn't think it is an Igbo story?
I think it's more of a Nigerian story.
A Nigerian story.
Every ethnic group in Nigeria was a catalyst in creating that war. The war came about not just because Igbo people wanted to separate from Nigeria. There was a reason why they wanted to separate, and Nigeria brought about that war.
And the question is?
And my question is that during the discussions we had about this film, a lot of Nigerians were happy that this film came out. But there's always been this question, which you have already addressed. But I think it's nice if you could clarify a little bit more about the Tanzania thing. The fact that you're telling our story, which is, I'm not Igbo, but I'm Nigerian, and it's also my story. And Tanzania thing, in my opinion, this is not fiction. This is a true story. I don't think Tanzania can tell me my story in the sense that you're telling the Nigerian.
Okay, I think I get the point here, and you too. So the question again being, I think which you have maybe already answered, or the question about Tandy Newton in the role of Olana.
Have you seen the film?
I'm going to say this week. No.
I think you should see it first. I mean, it's okay to talk about this in hypothetical terms, but you need to see the film, right? I think you might change your mind when you see the film. But I do think, in a larger sense, that what we're talking about then is that you can't have a character who's not from a particular place you can't have a person who's not from the character's sort of home play that character, right? And I don't agree with that at all. I think great art has come from people being able to inhabit other people. What I'm sympathetic to, though, is that clearly there's a history in which people like us haven't really been at the center of our own storytelling. That is true. But I think that when you're talking about making a film today, I don't want to be unkind and tell you to tell me who the heck would have played Olanna well, so I'll just move on. But you know, Biyi is making a film that has people who have put their money in it, right? So filmmaking is about also making a film where people actually want to go see it, so you want the best actors. It's just really a simple case of you want the best. And in Biyi's case, he's lucky that really what he considers the best is a yes. And when you see the film, I think you'll see why. I think Jannike is fantastic as Olanna.
Agreed. Anyone else? Before our time is up, over there. Maybe you should use the microphone here.
It's more than Nigerian.
I'm actually pretty loud. But okay.
Well, speaking about it, when for just a few minutes ago you mentioned about colonialism and such thing, not long ago, my friends and I went to the museum, and it was an African theme, and it was a modern. They wanted to show the modern style of Africa, from Nigeria to Tanzania to South Africa and Egypt, and he wanted to show more positive sides of it, and not just bad things about starvation, about civil war, and all this stereotypical sides of African continent. And what you said was, I agreed everything of what you said, and also it was thanks to your speech in the TED that I got very inspired, and that I decided that no, I'm not going to stay in the closet anymore. I'm going to be open feminist. Yes.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Chimamanda Ngozi. On behalf of the Igbo community, one Deo. Sorry, she always understands. She's the only one that understands what I'm saying. I'm trying to welcome her in her own traditional language. But going back to what you said, I have to comment, not a question. About feminists, you said it's a wonderful thing that needs to be discussed. And then I appreciate you trying to initiate those discussions. As we live here in Sweden, we all understand what feminism is all about, and equality and all the rest. I support you in that form, but I need some sort of contribution direction, because we've been working on that so much here in Sweden, around our brothers and sisters who are foreign living in Sweden also. You should look at it more on the cultural background of it, and that relates to what is happening. To look at it, not to look at it only on individuals or family issues. So there's a lot of cultural issues that affect how a group of people treat or raise their families. Coming back to your book, which is very fantastic, I will want you not to hesitate to allow more directors to air this different version of your book. Because in Nigerian Hollywood, they've been using the film industry to send in our cultural values all around the world. But some of them are not 100% representative of what
Could you
we have
please
today.
advance to your questions, so we will allow for some other people also?
Yeah, my question is for you to continue on what you are doing, and don't hesitate to allow some more directors to air different parts of your book. Thank you.
Okay. I'll keep that in mind.
Well, I have a very short question. I read the book, and I thought it was a really brilliant book. But while I was reading the book, there was something that always came to me all the time. I always wondered, what were your range of emotions when you were reading this book? When you were writing this book, sorry, because it involved you. Well, I'm Nigerian, but I'm Yoruba. So was there any resentment? Because you must have asked a lot of people about what happened, and because I've told you horrible stories.
Yeah. Yes, there were. I went through so many. There was resentment. There was anger. And I sometimes would read about something and think, I can't believe this actually happened in my country. It was also often quite emotional, because many of the stories in the book, actually, I think all of the stories in the book came from someone, right? So what I did was to embellish the stories, but the core of the stories were people's real stories. And I just often cried. There are times I just cried. But there are also times I felt just that sense of there's still something very beautiful about humanity. When I would read about people who got married in the middle of the war, or about people in northern Nigeria, Igbo people who were saved or helped by the northern friends when the massacres were going on, that kind of thing. So I had these moments of just sort of a quiet hope. Right? So I went through, it was really a vast range of reactions and emotions when I was writing it.
Yes. How autobiographical is your new novel, Americanah?
Not at all. Moving on.
But I read somewhere that you always put yourself into your characters a little bit.
Really?
Yes.
I just want to add something to my Nigerian brother at the back. I also think that that as a country we have to be willing to make ourselves uncomfortable when we confront our history. I think part of the reason that people, particularly the Nigerians who are not in Biafra, don't like to talk about the war is because it makes us uncomfortable. Because I think there's also a sense of, oh, you're blaming me, I wasn't there, I didn't know, that sort of thing. And we have to be willing to make ourselves uncomfortable, because I think it's important. I mean, it sounds very hackneyed to say, never again, but I do think that unless we know exactly what happened, we risk having it happen again. I think if we know about how horrible war is, when people start talking about separating and war, we can just say no, because we know that we've been there and it was a disaster. And about Americanah, no, actually, I wish, here's the thing, my life is a lot more boring. Ifemelu is a very interesting, much more interesting version of me. My life is just not that interesting. I wish it were. So when people have read Americanah as my story, which, I find amusing, because it really isn't. And I think that writers write a lot more about the lives they wish they had, rather than the lives they actually have, because they actually don't have lives. This is true. This is true. I mean, I think if anything, it's maybe that I used bits of. I use people's stories much more often than I use my stories. So I have friends who recognize themselves in the novel, but then I change things around. So the friend who's actually based on one character thinks that she's another character, because I've moved things around. But there are some bits of the book that are. So things like the experience with a relaxer burning her scalp, that happened to me. But minor things of that sort. Her life is just so much more fun. And I admire her very much. She's a character I admire very much.
You know what? We really hope that you keep on, dreaming about all those exciting lives that you would like to lead, and then eventually we can read about it. And that is really a final note for our discussion here today. And I'm very grateful for having you here on behalf of the festival and the international writer scene. So thank you so much for coming to Göteborg. And thank you all.